and Jolene, I mean, when you're born with cucumbers and tomatoes, you don't know anything about cattle. What do y'all grow? Speaking of that.
Well, we no longer have livestock. We used to have a big cow-calf herd. And when I first married Keith, we also had hogs. And I grew up Belgian draft horses. The big work horses were my specialty.
Yes,
but on our farm right now, we have grain. We have corn and soybeans. And if we still had critters, I wouldn't be speaking near as much as I am because I'd have to be here to do that work too.
Right.
And I always think it's funny because, I too can inseminate a cow, and I have been around when we castrate a bull. So people better behave around me or I get even. But I want to take back to Jeannie.
Yes.
After she and I talked, and I was going to her place in her home, and I had brought a long stem rose box, but I filled it with the long gloves you use when you inseminate a cow. So they go clear up to your armpit, right? I had them filled with helium. And I tied them off tight, and I put them in the rose boxes. And she thought she was getting 24 stem roses, and these arms come floating out.
Did she just pass out? How fun!
Yeah. And here's the funny thing: we would call that AI, artificial insemination, but that means artificial intelligence. So we can't do that anymore. You know. I'm always telling my farm audiences, you just got to be real careful because the world doesn't understand what we do. So I was just out in the Northwest, and I will tell you, Jane, there is a war being waged against the ranchers of the Northwest by our federal government by passing governances, not laws and things. And so when I'm out there and I listen to their stories and I know how hard they work, I just want to have people know that it's been a long time since we've been hungry in our country. And we can pass something, for example, in the state of California that has a huge effect all across the world, all the way up to the Supreme Court. Here's the funny thing. I do a podcast called The Oval Table out in California. It's all about family business, not just agriculture, but family business. And so there's a lot of consumers that listen to that. So I had a call a few weeks ago from an irate consumer because she's paying $12 for a dozen eggs. Now, these are local, organic, natural, brown ones, free range, cage-free eggs, okay? And she thought we farmers were scalping them. And so I reminded her of the proposition passed in California that said no egg can come into their state unless it meets the requirements that the state of California passed. And therefore, farmers can't afford to redo all of their facilities. And those who have it had to have a lot of the chickens murdered because of your proposition. So I said to her, if you go down the soup aisle, it's going to be cheap because there's a lot of chicken noodle soup out there.
Oh. Well, Jolene, what did she say to that?
Well, she hung up.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
So, there is a world, Jane, that doesn't understand the world of agriculture. And yet they depend and they decide whether or not we can do what we do. So I just did a big audience thing. It was on TV and so on. And I said, food is produced on our soil is really national security. Because I'm one mother who never wants to be dependent on another country for our family's food supply.
Yes.
And they don't look at it like that. So what happened is then the Wall Street Journal had called, and now we're doing more and more on this. We've got to get out the word of the importance of having food and fiber and fuels produced on our own soil.
Right.
If not, we should have learned from oil, but we didn't. Now we're dependent on countries that hate us again. So we've got a lot to learn, but food is something so precious, needed 3 times a day. We've always said, once in my lifetime, I'm going to need a funeral home director, I hope. And we're probably going to need a teacher, we're probably going to need a fireman and a policeman, but every day, 3 times a day, you need a farmer.
Yeah.
And we have this is FFA time, Future Farmers of America time.
Oh,
and
yes.
This is the time where we're reminded once again of the value of keeping the legacy of this industry viable. Right. But when the world shuts us down, because all that it takes is an emotional issue, a catchy headline, and a Hollywood celebrity, and it's true.
That is so true. And that happened with the apple industry out in Washington State. Is it Meryl Streep that said that apples are not good for you? And that it shut down I remember speaking in Leavenworth, and it's a little Bavarian village now outside of Washington, in Washington State, outside of Seattle. And they created a beautiful village because the apple industry went to nothing because of one person making one comment that was not accurate. So I remember that like it was yesterday, because I thought, wow, you all have taken this and created a beautiful venue, but the poor apple growers, they're done for. But daddy struggled with that too, even with tomatoes, how difficult it was. And when there's so many rules and regulations, and people with college degrees that doesn't know, they don't know any from a corn stalk from a cucumber. They don't know, but they got these government jobs. And boy, daddy would just pitch a fit over some of that stuff that he had to do. But you're so right. People don't realize that food is not grown in a grocery store. That's why I love Farm Bureaus and FFA and all those ag groups, especially Farm Bureau, doing ag in the classroom. That's huge to help kids understand exactly where agriculture and the beginning and the end, the genesis, the harvesting, the whole thing. That's what I'm saying. I love that.
Well, anytime that you're 1% of the population producing that food, you are certainly a minority. And it's an extremely worthwhile and blessed occupation, but it sure is easy to be shut down on a whim. And people get tired of fighting. When the war is out there, when you just want to just say, I give up, I just give up. But if enough people just give up, let me tell you, what's left isn't going to be good for our country or for my family, because we want our food. And again, there's not everything grown on our soil. We don't do a real good job with bananas, for example, in America, although they can be in places. So, but we then have trading partners. But, agriculture is one of the very few industries that actually puts money into our banking account as a country because of our exports.
Right.
And so anything that we can do to understand and listen to the other side of the story would be very helpful. I get called, especially on airplanes, when you meet somebody and they hear you're a real Farmer Brown. And, after listening, and I tell them I make disposable diapers, which I do because I make corn. I tell them, you don't have to wear polyester anymore because that polymer can be made from corn. And that dashboard to your car, it comes from my soybeans. I know there is 4,000 uses for a kernel of corn. And I always have to match what I do to what they need, because the value of what we do is in the eye of the purchaser, not the producer. Just as speakers, the value of what we do is not in what we say, it's in the need that we meet and the way it is delivered. And so as we can apply that to whatever anyone's job is, the value of what you do is in the eye of the consumer, not the creator, the purchaser, not the producer.
That's so true.
Until we can say what we do in terms of what they value, they will put us out of business.
That is so true. So well said, Jolene. You keep up with all the trends in agriculture. It's impressive. You must really study what's going on.
And as when you're at these meetings, we sit in at all the sessions,
Oh, yeah.
It is so important that we, as I say, I don't walk in everybody's shoes, but since I deal with the human side of agriculture, in agriculture, they have all kinds of resources for their production. The weeds, the seeds, the breeds, the feeds, the money, machinery, and marketing, but they're crappy with people. It's the people on their farm that do other production. It's the people in Washington, D.C. It's the consumer in the grocery store. Those are all people. And so my job is to help with the human side, the people skills of production.